Hey y'all, welcome to this video where I'm going to talk through some of the tips for success in the class. This is a fairly um, broad view. Obviously, there's a lot more work to be done than what I'm going to discuss here, but these are the three things. If you really focus on doing these things, you'll be more successful in the class than if you don't do them. So the first thing, and you'll see when we look at the class in future videos, I've recorded a number of video lectures. And these are essentially a video lecture where you'll see a PowerPoint and you'll hear me discussing the contents of the chapter. So, for example, there's a chapter on delivery, and there are multiple video lectures where I talk through some of the things I'm going to be looking for in your delivery. So, for example, you are going to try to minimize your vocal pauses. You're going to try to say, like, as little as possible. I go into a lot more detail, but in any event, so you're going to see a PowerPoint just like you might if I was lecturing in a classroom. You're going to hear me talking through the concepts just like if we were in a classroom together. And studying those lectures is really important. So when I say study, I don't mean put the lecture on while you're watching TV. I don't mean listen to it while you're folding laundry. What I mean is do what you would do if you were in a classroom. So, what good students do when they're in a classroom listening to a lecture is they listen, they take notes. Here's a couple of things about studying the lectures. On the one hand, you can't raise your hand, ask a question, and get an immediate answer. But there are ways for you to ask questions, which I'll talk about in a video coming up soon. But on the other hand, you do have the ability to pause the video, go back and re listen to another section. You have the ability to stop in the middle of a lecture because you have something else to do. Maybe you're getting a little brain tired and you need a break. So, on the one hand, face to face classrooms, you get the advantage of hearing the lecture with me in the room. You can stop me and ask me questions. But on the other hand, the advantage you get here is you can control stopping, starting, going back, skipping forward. A lot of times with lectures like this, I'll listen to them on two times the speed, depending on how the person speaks. So you can still understand what they're saying. You can pause it and rewind it if you need to get it, but you can go through them a little more quickly. Anyway, you need to study these just like you would a lecture in a classroom. And then the other thing I wanted to talk about is the reason why these are so important. So, some of you might be thinking, I can read, I'm fairly smart, I don't need you to regurgitate what the book says to me. But that's not actually what these lectures do. So, of course, first, I will discuss the concepts I asked you to read about in the book. Just like in a face to face class, you might see on the schedule chapter 4, and then you come to class and the professor lectures about chapter 4. So I do talk about what the book says, but for the most part, these lectures are designed to teach you things I want you to do in your speeches and for you to understand how I'm going to grade you in your speeches. So when I teach you about using verbal pauses, then on the speech rubric, you're going to see an entry, vocal use of pauses, and then it's going to grade you based on did you pause correctly / did you use vocal pauses too much. So I start with that. What does the book say? But then sometimes in the video lectures, I'll tell you don't do what that part of the book says. So on the preparation outline for your informative and persuasive speech, you follow about 95% of the book, but there are a couple things I don't want you to do. I tell you about that in the video lecture. Sometimes I say, okay, the book explains this, but I want you to do it a little differently than what the book says. So these video lectures essentially are me teaching you exactly what you need to know and do to be successful in the speech assignments. There are no exams in this class. There's no papers. You're going to write 3 speeches. You're going to deliver 3 speeches. And if I'm giving you a video lecture, I'm telling you exactly what you need to do to succeed. Last thing about these is, honestly, I don't know how anybody who doesn't study these will pass the class. And I guess the other thing I'll say, just to be upfront, when you turn in something, it's very obvious if you watched these video lectures or not. They describe a specific style of writing, a specific style of outlining. Citing is different in a speech than it is in a paper. And so when you turn in assignments, it's very clear that you didn't actually study these lectures. And so don't do that to yourself. Study the lectures. I'll show you in a lot more detail in the next video how to go through the class. But I just want you to know now there are a lot of video lectures that you need to plan on studying for, just like lectures in a classroom. All right, so that's big tip number 1. Tip number 2 is avoiding the number 1 reason why students fail this class, which is that they miss due dates. Now, in a face-to-face classroom, at the end of every class, I'm going to tell you, okay, don't forget on Tuesday, be ready to talk about chapter 11, or don't forget your outlines are due by midnight on Monday. So I get to remind you twice a week what's coming up later in the semester. But in the online classroom, a lot of that is on you. And so there are a couple of different ways to track what's due when. I'm going to show you that in a different video. And also, I'll be sending out announcements fairly frequently to try to keep you on track. But you'll notice sometimes due dates are fairly close together. And so if you just forget about the class for 4 days, you might miss 3 or 4 quizzes. And then people who should have gotten a B will get a C. People who should have gotten a C will get a D. And occasionally a student fails because they missed deadlines. As I said, I'll show you about this in Canvas in another video. A couple of other things about missed due dates. First of all, don't procrastinate. One of the biggest problems is in order to give a speech, you need to write a speech. So if you procrastinate the writing, you're also procrastinating the time you have to practice the delivery of the speech. So this is the way I'll explain it. You'll probably hear this in another video. If you have a speech due on Monday, you want the speech written, by Wednesday or Thursday. So ideally, you can practice a few times over those 4 or 5 days to be ready for your speech delivery. If you want a speech written on Wednesday, you probably have to start it, at least a week beforehand. So if you wait until the last minute to write the speech outlines, what you're essentially doing is decreasing the time you have to practice your speech delivery. Also, technology is not an excuse, and I can't say this enough. If you're borrowing Wi-Fi and you're not getting a good signal at 11:59 when something is due, that's not an excuse. If you didn't realize how long it would take to upload your video to YouTube, that is not an excuse. And what you need to do, since this is a technology-driven class, you should always be trying to finish things at least a day or 2 early so that you can turn it in and make sure technology isn't going to be a problem. It's very rare that I'm going to give you an extension or allow you to turn and work with no penalty because you say, I got locked out of an assignment or I didn't have Wi-Fi. So you need to give yourself time to solve technological issues in order to turn stuff in during the due date. But okay, so the first tip, study the video lectures. The second tip, make sure you turn stuff in on time and keep on top of the schedule. And then the third tip, and this is a big one, follow all of the rules for recording your videos. There are a lot of rules, and I'll explain them and in more detail why they exist in a separate video. But the biggest thing right now is that you have to have an audience of 9 people. So for your 3 speech recordings, You are going to have 9 people in the room with you. They are going to sit and listen to you. You are going to stand and deliver your speech to them. You're going to record yourself doing this. You have to have 9 people. There are no exceptions to this. There's no getting around the 9 people. 7 won't work. You can't have them on Skype. You know, there's only one way to do the class. You have 9 people in your audience. And I'll just briefly explain why. In a face-to-face setting, we would never teach this with less than 9 students in the class. So if you took this class face-to-face, you're always going to have 8 other students in your audience plus the professor. That's 9 people in the audience. So what we decided as a department is if we wouldn't run a class face-to-face with 8 audience members, then we won't allow students online to do speeches in front of any less than 9 people. So you're getting exactly the same thing, the worst case a class could get. So you have to have the 9 people. There's no debating this. There are no exceptions. If you're sure you can't get 9 people or you don't want to try, you should drop the class or switch classes, you know, whatever you can do. All of the online classes have the same rules. It's listed in CSN on the course schedule, and so there's no getting around that. Okay, so to wrap this up, the first thing I wanted to say is if you do the work as I've explained it in all of the videos that you're going to listen to this week, if you follow the class the way it's set up and you do the work, I promise you, you will be a better writer and a better speaker by the end of the semester that you were at the beginning. So if people really do sit down and study, if they do really research their speeches and take the time to write them correctly, if they practice the speech delivery, if they go through the process of recording their speeches, students always do really well and they get better. So you might already be good, and that's the best case scenario, no pressure on either of us. But for most people, there is room for improvement, and I promise you, you will improve if you do the work of the class. And you'll be way more comfortable giving speeches, which is what most successful people need to do. Okay, last thing, and then I'm going to sign off on this one. Do not do the work of the class on your phone. Now, on the one hand, I know a lot of younger people do a lot on their phone. My daughter does all kinds of stuff. She writes papers on her phone. But inevitably, when I did teach face-to-face, when a student would come up to me and say, hey, I had this problem with Canvas, they're showing me their phone. And so I can't vouch for the Canvas app. I guess I don't see how you could do this kind of complicated work on the small screen size phone. I don't know if the tablet or iPad apps are any better, but I write and work in the class on either my iMac or on a Mac laptop. And so you probably should plan on doing the same. Now, I have no doubt there are people who succeed in the class on a phone or on a tablet, but especially if you're not technologically good. Like if you're one of these people who's like, I don't know how to turn on a computer. Well, first, I'm not sure what you're doing in this class, but put that aside for a second. You really need the real estate of a full screen. So I strongly suggest you do not use your phone to work on the class. Okay, so that's it. So far, hopefully you've watched the welcome video, and this is sort of a big picture tips video. And now, as you move through the class, I'm going to give you more specific information for where to go, what to look at, and how to do things. As always, if you have any questions, ask in the CCQs, and I'll be definitely talking to you more later. Thanks. Bye.